So welcome, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to our 37th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. We're very pleased to have, I'll give Roger the title of an economic historian for the purposes of today. Roger is you might call himself a local historian, he's a sport historian. He works with the Supporters Trust Reading and hence works closely with Reading Football Club. And so the Reading Football Club will form some part of his talk today. He's going to talk about England's first football boom between 1872 and 1914 and its 21st century parallels. Roger's got about 60 minutes in which to talk, and then there'll be time for about 30 minutes of Q&A. If in the meantime you want to use the chat feature, please do. And if you can keep your microphones muted and your cameras off in the meantime, that will be fantastic. And so, Roger, it's over to you.
Is the dishwasher supposed to be ready?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Okay. Can you all see the introductory slide there?
Yeah, we've got the slide, Roger.
Excellent. Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think James is flattering somewhat to call me an economic historian, but my degree is in history, and I spent most of my professional life in marketing. And in both of those arenas, one of the great subjects of interest is change, the pace of change, the intensity of change, the shape of change, the motives behind change. And in marketing, we looked at that in the sense of how did the video recorder expand in the 1980s? What kind of demographic groups, and what might that tell us about how smartphone adoption happened in the 2010s? So change, history and marketing are some of the foundations of this talk. There's a little ball bubbling around, which you'll see. So we're looking from 1872 to 1914, where at the start, football was just a barely codified participation sport. That's England versus Scotland at the Oval in 1875, I think. And yet, by the end of the period, we have something that is a national urban phenomenon, and it's become our greatest sporting export. This is the first football boom. And what echoes of this past can we hear when we consider what's happening in the disruptive world of football today? We move from here, 1872, from the age of the player to the age of the spectator, and we are now in the 21st century in the age of the viewer. As James has alluded, I'm a relatively unusual speaker for Roses. I feel like an amateur amongst the professionals here, but I have been working with James and the university on various bids and heritage projects. And some of you may know my name from writing in When Saturday Comes magazine, our national football fanzine in the UK for many years. And I also work with the Football Supporters Association, and we've started a blog to save the nation's football memorabilia called The Great Save. And I'm also an author, and a large part of what I'll be talking about is based on this book, The Lost Years of Reading Football Club, which I published a little while back, and is 10 years worth of research and writing went into that to understand how the club emerged over the period 1871 to about 1900. In that, I was trying to get away from the linear silo kind of approach to club histories, where you just focus on the one sport and the one club, and you don't understand why the club succeeds, why others fail, why football succeeds. So in the Lost Years, I try and set the story amid all the different competing pressures, be it other sports clubs, social pressures, economic pressures. And there was a review of the book, if you're interested in that, in Sport in History a year or two ago. And what I found doing that was that the historiography of early football is dominated by two themes. The focus on the origins of the game, the rules. Was it Cambridge? Was it Sheffield? And secondly, on a examination of the amateur versus professional conflict, which emerged in the 1880s and never really felt fully resolved until the end of this period, and is of great interest to socialists. What I think is lacking a bit in understanding the football boom is a view of it in business and cultural terms, and in particular, one key decade. So I warn you here and now, because I've attended quite a number of Rose's talks that end with a conclusion after an argument. This one is not an argument, not a proposition. It's a journey into the past, and during this journey, you may well find some signposts to the present and the future. Let us go right back to the start, find out first of all what happened. Secondly, ask the question, why was it football and not other sports that benefited in this era of Victorian expansionism in the late 19th century UK? And then look briefly at the common factors that go into the recent booms in football in this country. So a series of 5-step changes. Why do I start the story in 1872 when the Football Association was founded in 1863? It's about competition and it's about geography. 1872 saw the first FA Cup final, our first national competition, the first international match in the world between England and Scotland, actually also the first Reading match, and the growth of town-based clubs. Prior to this, clubs tended to be based around an occupation, an old boys club, or they were called things like vampires or mosquitoes. And one of the great progenitors of association football at this time was a Scotsman living in London called Lord Kinnaird, who was a notably violent player. And his wife feared for his safety and once asked one of his friends, "I fear that he will come back from the match one day with a broken leg." The friend replied, "He may well do, but it won't be his own." To take a little local glimpse and a little bit of economics here, and I've enjoyed seeing the complex accounts that have been put forward in this series of talks over the autumn. Here's one of the more simple football club accounts you'll ever see, which is Maidenhead Football Club, a club about 10 miles away from Reading, where all the income tends to be generated by membership fees of 2 different grades, and a well-balanced book there, with travel, printing and stamps being the major expenditure, ground rent very low. We talk about England here, but England at this point in time is a footballing nation of 2 halves. The industrial part of Britain, here in red, the northern, more urban, much more industrial part of 19th century Britain, which adopted professionalism and professional attitudes and gate money much earlier than the blue part of England here, the southern part, where amateur attitudes ruled the roost rather longer. Charles Alcott was the secretary of the Football Association, a northerner based in London, in the Oval in London. And he made a prophecy in 1880 saying that the recreation of a few has become the pursuit of thousands. Enforced training is almost turning football into a profession. And he was quite right in that. 1875 sees the launch of the first football publication, the Athletic News. We have experiments with floodlit football at Bramall Lane and the Oval in 1878. We have huge crowds for the time, like 14,000 cramming in to watch Aston Villa against Wednesbury. So many that they stood on the dressing room roof and made it collapse. And you had the first northern team from a mill town called Darwin grappling with the old boys of Eton College. And there's a picture of Bramall Lane under floodlights. And in one game at the Oval, they had a floodlight which tried to follow the path of the ball. This was not a success. What was a success was the FA Cup, and from this graph you can see the number of clubs entering the FA Cup over this period, and see the growth much more dramatic in the 1880s and powered by entrants from that red northern half of England. The third step comes in the mid-1880s, where money comes into it and better rules. First of all, we see a clarification and a unification of the laws of the game amongst the home nations. So issues like the throw-in, which was a bit of a free-for-all, become standardised. We see the first full home international tournament between England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales taking place. Five-figure crowds become quite common in the north of England and in Scotland. But we also get attendant on this disputes, rowdyism amongst the crowd, foul play, serious injuries, and some of the middle class, or rather upper middle class people, beginning to leave the game that they initiated. And we have Preston North End, the kind of professional club, causing a crisis in 1884 by being expelled from the FA Cup for playing professionals, and causing a reaction which threatened to break the game in two, as happened with rugby 10 years later, and go away and form the British Football Union. But the FA, in their wisdom, allowed a certain amount of professionalism after 1885. So the game was northern dominated at that point, but it's almost British in a way. So we had Blackburn Olympic, the first industrial team, as it were, to win the FA Cup. And in 1884 and 85, a Scottish team were the beaten finalists in the English Cup. You look at this third round draw from 1886, and it's an incredible mix. Aston Villa play Wolves. They're playing them again this weekend. Next one, Partick Thistle of Glasgow played Cliftonville of Belfast. Then Marlow, a very small town near Reading, played Dulwich, a suburb of London. Then two old boys teams, Westminster School and Eton School, old boys play each other. Chirk, a team from North Wales, played Golden Hill, possibly a team from Newtopia. I don't know, I never traced them. Lockwood Brothers is a factory team. They're playing future twice winners of the European Cup, Nottingham Forest. So you have the template of a British sport rather than an English sport at that point. And the first world champions are, well, it was a contest between the Scottish Cup winners and the English Cup winners, and it was won by Renton, which is a small village in West Dunbartonshire. But they were the world champions apparently in 1888. It wasn't all plain sailing. As the Birmingham Post put it in 1886, they fear the game has passed its zenith, and they say gate money is the death of true sport. Football cannot be both a business and a sport, and every year it is becoming more of a business. This is absolutely true. The public are quick to recognise it, and popular favour is lost to the game. That is so untrue. Meanwhile, back in the south, tiny amounts of money. Reading paying £3 a season to rent the ground, getting up to £15 by 1890. Membership of the club is very small, admission price is very small, the amount of money the club have in the bank, very small. That stands in contrast to what Aston Villa and Preston have. And yet it seems as though there's plenty of money around in the south of England, as large sums can be raised to build a boathouse, or the athletic club have a huge amount of money. An individual cup worth £8.75, that would take 700 football spectators to account for that amount of money, is offered as the prize in one event. Oxfordshire pay £50, an enormous amount, just for a trophy. To focus today on the fourth step in this, and I think the 1890s is a rather overlooked decade in football history, because in economic terms, that's when takeoff was achieved, when football became an organised, a professionalised and a national sport. It's about the explosion of leagues. We have the Football League, founded in 1888. Following year, the Football Alliance followed with clubs that had been rejected or not considered for the Football League, and in turn that became Football League Division 2. And then the Southern League was founded in 1894 for Southern clubs, and there were several other London leagues at the time. The West London League, in which Fulham played QPR, the North London League in Reading. There were leagues for the schools and junior leagues. There was the Northern League, the Midland Counties League, the Yorkshire Rugby League, the Cricket County Championship. So the idea of a league, an exclusive competition, was there and was instantly popular, and it had economic justification. Outsiders dubbed it a cartel, a charmed circle, a ring. In effect, the Football League imposed local monopolies, brought in standard admission prices and transfer registration restrictions. And we have, just as the league starts in 1888, the Cup winners' captain of West Bromwich Albion wants to become a director of the new limited company and is not allowed. It's the end of players as club members as having an influence on the direction of the club in strategic terms. But the league brought in an unexpected magic. For the first time, you get a sustained interest as well as the immediate interest of the day. So you have a game that lasts an afternoon and a contest that lasts a season. Today's defeat is not fatal. Today's victory is not secure. So in 6 years, Football League gates boom, up 275%, up 153% in Division 1. Clearly the league is expanding from 12 to 32 clubs, but the average per first division club goes up almost 40% in that 6 years. Terrific boom. Meanwhile, back in Reading, outside the charmed circle, gate receipts, £12, oh dear. But the club is reformed, it's put on a more organised and professional facing footing, even though still being amateur. And you can see how the figures burgeon, even though still an amateur team, turning professional in 1895, and then whacking up the receipts to nearly £2,000 once they have their own stadium and become a limited company in 1897. There was unmined potential financially in the South. The London FA was very rigorously amateur and resisted, but Southerners had a taste for professional football. Arsenal soon had the biggest gates in the Northern Football League Division 2, over 6,500. Coming up to Reading, still an amateur club here, but 12,000 watched 3 Easter home matches, and they're coming across the River Thames on a very dodgy ferry with a combined match ticket. And we're already catering for the affluent support of the executive class with seats, sheltered accommodation, match cards, brougham transport. It's like an executive coach that picks you up from the Reading Town Centre Hotel and takes you up the muddy path across the river to Caversham, where the club played. Here we have a set of league tables. Okay, it is 1907, but it shows the Southern League second in precedence here, in between the Football League First Division and the Second Division. And if you look at the attendances there, you see the Southern League's attendances are in excess of Division 2. And some of the work I've been doing with James Reade over the past year is looking again at the status of the Southern League, which provided England internationals, which provided representative 11s that could beat Football League representative 11s, which was capable of producing clubs who would beat Football League clubs in the FA Cup, the only competition in which they met. Let us not forget that Tottenham, the last club outside the Football League to win the FA Cup, were indeed a Southern League club. This boom also is an interesting one about how big did clubs expect to get. So Black Star was a team in Blackburn. They combined with a team from a street to become Blackburn Olympic, and they won the FA Cup, but they weren't as big a team as Blackburn Rovers. Everton, Do you know where it is? It was on the map before. It's a district in Liverpool, Fulham, a district in London, Aston, a district in Birmingham. But those clubs have retained their district names to this day, whereas others, Ardwick and Newton Heath, have not. They've changed their branding, they've become city-based. And I find it interesting that no clubs from that era dared to call themselves London Rovers or Glasgow United or something like that. Clubs did not expect to be metropolitan to that extent when they started out. But what we did see during this period of the 1890s is municipalisation, not just in sports, but also, gas, cemetery companies and so on within towns. So the consolidation came behind one town team, and some of the name changes reflect that. Small Heath and Birmingham, for instance, not the best example, but Singers and Coventry City is perhaps a better one of a single club. Bedminster as well. No, that's not a good example either. Anyway, league clubs become limited companies from 1888 onwards. Small Heath was the first, and there's a massive shift towards that in the 1890s, because in order to pay players, they need to attract gates. In order to attract gates, they need a bigger stadium capacity with roof on to keep the poor weather off people, and with good transport links. So municipalisation, consolidation behind a team. There's a kind of local pride there, and you get a lot of industrial or commercial nicknames. The Potters of Stoke, the Blades of Sheffield United, the Biscuit Men of Reading, the Hatters of Stockport and Luton, the Railway Men of Crewe, the Mariners of Grimsby, the Hammers of West Ham, the Dockers of Millwall, the Villains of Aston Villa, the team that stole the FA Cup, I believe, in 1895. It was never recovered. But there are exceptions to this one city, one club rule, some less obvious than others. So we still have two professional clubs in Bristol and in Stoke and in Nottingham and in Dundee. The 1890s was an era of disruption. There was a row at Everton, there was a split that led to the formation of Liverpool. We have Newcastle clubs amalgamating into Newcastle United. Arsenal turning professional against the wishes of the London FA, becoming the first Southerns to join the Football League. We have figures like George Ramsay and Tom Wharton creating football businesses. They were the Alex Ferguson and Arsene Wenger of their day. We see the exclusion of teams like Old Carthusians and the amateurs from any league structure. And we see a counter-reaction, the launch of the FA Amateur Cup and a short-lived county championship for the South. We see football coupons launched and subsequently banned. As I say, the growth of limited companies recommended if you have a turnover of over 1,000, which many would have done by that point. And we get many southern clubs issuing share issues that are often far from fully subscribed, looking at the work by Rave Lamplugh on that matter. And the FA, worried about people trying to make too much money out of football in those days, put a limit on the amount of dividend that could be paid, though few were in a position to pay that. Here's a shameless bit of copying from Watford, who nick or borrow Stockport County's articles of association to do their launch of a company. We have a boom in football media, both nationally and locally. This is what's available at Reading when they're still an amateur club and haven't yet played any league game. All those titles available by the time they are in a league. And professional, the Reading Observer has a Saturday issue, and all the nationals have Reading correspondents called things like Biscuit Boy. And there is a reaction to all this media coverage, this interest, kids playing football in the streets and so on. So people talk about football mania, football madness. Politics, religion, the fate of empires, the interests of government, life and death itself must lead to the supreme fascination and excitement of football. I think Bill Shankly said it in fewer words rather later on. And then the fifth step, I think, is the Edwardian boom, where the number of professional clubs expands even further, over 400. I imagine that includes Scotland as well, but 7,000 professional players, far in excess, more than double what we have today. The increase in attendance is now up to 9 million in the Football League, and you could add on another 3 million, I'm sure, for the Southern League. And the Football League cherry picking these different bigger population centres for inclusion into the league. So they went for Bristol, Chelsea, Bradford and Tottenham, and the smaller Lancashire clubs like Darwin, Glossop, Accrington found themselves on the wrong end of history there. C.B. Fry, the famous amateur, says, "Whoever undertakes the commercial management has more to do with the sporting success than the players." And A.F. Hills, who was the chairman of Thames Ironworks that became the professional West Ham United, "The weight of our purses can be made the measure of our glory." So it didn't go down well with the amateur hierarchy. Here's Villa Park, 1910. Absolutely packed. And you can see in the top right-hand corner of that picture the hill leading up to Aston Hall, I think after which Villa Park was named. But here's the plan for it in a later time, a capacity before the First World War, I think, of over 104,000. Just fancy being at the back of one of those end terraces and thinking, I'm going to pop to the loo, I'll be back in 10 minutes. I don't think you will. And an export, British clubs touring Europe, crossing the Atlantic, 23 clubs playing in 15 different countries in 1912. Here's Reading in 1913, a successful tour of Italy, where they beat the Italian national team and AC Milan and were dubbed the greatest team ever seen in Italy, a claim which I hope still holds. And most famous of all, Exeter City, diverting from Argentina at the end of their tour to play in Brazil, the first English professional club to play in Brazil. What a wonderful photograph that is, redolent of a quite different era. But it led to a legacy, a touring legacy. Exeter City had a rematch in 100 years later with Brazil in some form or another. Notts County's kit is Juventus's kit. The name Corinthians from London goes to Brazil. Its colours go to Real Madrid. There are plenty of anglicised football club names around the world. We have these glorious kits from that era. Here's Bradford Park Avenue, Watford, Grimsby, Tottenham, Manchester United, and here's a young Ryan Giggs modelling a revamped version of that, but 3 colours of stripes on a shirt. Showed a lot of confidence. And enduring stadia coming out. The picture here of Goodison in 1895, the church is still there. You can barely see it in the bottom picture, squeezed between those 2 stands, but for plenty of other grounds that were built in that era and endured. And of course, the Premier League's only 19th century pitch-side changing pavilion, the Cottage at Craven Cottage, Fulham, still with us. And to put the seal on football's boom, the royal seal of football's boom, here is the King attending the FA Cup final for the first time, sitting comfortably, smoking in a wooded seating area, while other fans of very large attendance stand rather more precariously to look at the game. So why was it that it was football that drew people in this way? Well, I'm going to start in a curious place, men with clubs. I don't know what that phrase quite means to you, but let's go here. The peak of homosocial leisure life was coinciding with our first football boom. The club was a central part of male life, a refuge from the chaos of modern life, a space free from women, and indeed children, servants, domestic callers. So that was the gentleman's club, but there were a wave of clubs at other levels of society and for other purposes, extending into sport, rowing clubs, football clubs, cricket clubs, rugby clubs, as well as into politics, occupation, working men's clubs, and so on. But as we get to the 1890s, there's a major shift to it becoming much more commercial, members having less say over what the club puts on and hiring professionals to do it for them. And there are obvious parallels here with football clubs. We also have in this era, and sociologists and economic historians have pointed this out for the best part of 50 years, an increase in leisure time. At various times, Birmingham had more Saturday afternoon leisure much earlier than Liverpool, for instance, and growth in real wages. But you again have to ask the question, why was it football that benefited and not all these other sports which were also present in our society at that time? And I think that is down to the very nature of football itself. And I will read you a very short passage from The Lost Years about that. Judging by the metaphors used in the match reports of the 1870s and 1880s, football purloined the positives of the theatre, the battlefield and the hunt in producing its own magnetic amalgam. From the theatre, it copied the idea of a fully observable stage or field of play, unlike racing or rowing, and a duration that was long enough to absorb and not too long that it might bore, unlike tug of war or cricket. From the battlefield, it brought the concept of a fight without real fighting, of colours lowered, citadels stormed, fortresses maintained, of an uncertain and thus nerve-wracking outcome, yet everyone goes home to live another day. From the hunt, the old winter sport, came the sense of excitement of the chasing pack and the exhilaration of the rare moment in which the prey is killed, or more prosaically, a goal is scored. Football as a game managed to pit attractive opposites against each other in which the balance between them was ever changing. Strength faced skill, defence responded to attack, teamwork could be the master, but so could individuality. Impulse was sometimes for the best, but so too was restraint. And then there was football's golden ingredient, the balance between merit and luck. Because football matches were decided only by one measure, the crude, rare, arbitrary and hugely variable scoring of goals, it meant that the better team won most of the time, but the lucky team could win or draw often enough to keep the game and the sport interesting. We also have support in terms of health attitudes towards health, healthy mind, healthy body. One of Reading's very early players. I don't think his career path has ever been emulated, but in his autobiography, he wrote that about playing football then. And we also have an economic historian on the playing roster, A.G.L. Rogers, the son of J. Thorold Rogers, was a player for Reading at one time. Football created habit, created ritual. There was a flow of events. In September, the annual general meeting, you hear what the fixtures are, you practice, you play the home and home, as they were called, friendlies, where you would take it in turns to visit each other's ground. You'd have cup dates, you'd have Boxing Day treats, special events on a Boxing Day, and indeed on Easter, where people came to tour. You'd have five-a-side tournaments or matches where people dressed up in pantomime clothes, for instance. And then you'd close the season with the annual dinner, songs, toasts, awards to the better players in the club. Football had strong organisations. The Football League and the Football Association didn't always get on, but they had complementary strengths, and there was a willingness to improve the rules. So we got penalty kicks to stop foul play and people handling the ball on the goal line. We got rid of umpires who belonged to each club and put in neutral linesmen. There were nets. There was a willingness to compromise over professionalism, the amateur club, mixed international teams of amateurs and professionals. We had a new audience here, this huge expansion of lower grade clerical, administrative and shop jobs in that era, a more youthful and increasingly urban society. And these people were fans and also organisers. Football became part of urban consumption culture in late Victorian and Edwardian England. It fitted into the work patterns. People knocked off work at 12 o'clock on a Saturday. That gave them enough time to get to the match. Transport options, tramways, trains, they made a huge difference in allowing people to travel some distance to watch a game. And pubs, the influence of brewers, particularly as shareholders and directors of football club, are significant, and lots of men used to go to the pub after the game to talk over what has happened, and they might well be reading Sporting Pinks, newspapers brought out with a report of the game that happened and finished but half an hour ago, along with all the other magazines. Betting, statistics and reasoning added to the compulsion and the interest, made it more real. So various sports historians have talked about football in this era becoming the supreme social experience. You could enjoy the vicarious glory of your team, and it gave you symbolic citizenship of your town or your club or your district. There was a reaction to this. The founders of football moved away, and they moved away to other sports, with each pulse of football growth during this time, to sports such as these. What parallels can we draw with what's going on now? How has the shape of change then been reflected in the shape of changes that we've seen in the most recent era? Well, English football, after that burst of activity, was static for very many years. It took 33 years for the Football League to grow from 12 to 86 clubs. And then in the next, 65 years, it added just 6 more clubs. Very few new clubs were elected into our Football League. And there were no significant changes to the divisional structure or the FA Cup structures. We stuck with 2 points for a win, with goal average determining the league table until 1981, when it became 3 points for a win. Very few clubs built new grounds, new stadia. The capacity was still largely standing, quite a lot of it still in the open air. And the company structures that underpinned the commercial life of these football clubs was very largely unchanged from 1900. It would be a board of directors of local businessmen, by and large, with not a great deal of money to put in. So what we see here is the aggregate number of people in millions who attended the Football League matches over this period, of which there are about 2,000 matches per season. So we go from a peak of about 41 million just after the Second World War to where the game slumps after the Heysel disaster and other disasters in about 1985, where football is described as a slum game. And just to show that I do know the difference between cause and coincidence, you shouldn't take this bit too seriously, but the magazine I write for, When Saturday Comes, was launched at this precise point. And we see after that an upward trend in attendance. These are volume figures. If you talk about it in terms of value figures, that is the amount paid, then I think we're well back up to what people were paying immediately after the Second World War, because ticket prices are relatively much more expensive. So as in the 1890s, we have a confluence of positive factors kicking off the new boom. We have, first of all, the reaction of fans to try and save the game in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, with their fanzines, the inflatable bananas and fried eggs and killer whales and so on that were on the terraces. We had the effect of the playoff system being introduced into English football, which stimulated the league season in a very positive manner, giving more clubs more of a chance. Taylor report after the Hillsborough disaster gave us a reset on stadium safety and design. England's successful performance in Italia 90 and Paul Gascoigne and his tears. And suddenly we had a sport that was again for the fashionable middle class. broadsheet newspapers, and a certain amount of fashionable football literature coming out at that time that brought football more back into the mainstream. But we also have similar business drivers to the 1890s. These new and better stadia allow for higher revenue capture, as we would have seen in the 1890s. New business entities. Irving Scholar at Spurs, I think, was the first to issue shares. Football clubs becoming PLCs, various holding companies becoming involved. Not all these things were great successes, it must be said, but there was a massive change in the pattern of ownership and the structure of ownership, where single and often foreign owners, rather than boards of local businessmen, took over the direction of football clubs. And like the newspapers and magazines of the 1890s, we have new media, more TV, more radio channels, and crucially, satellite TV. 1992, the first Sky deal with the Premier League that allows broadcast internationally. We see a change in the role of media. They become business partners, not objective critics. If you want to read objective criticism about football, it's better to go back to the 1890s. Similar cultural drivers. So we've got a new audience here at home, a bit more middle class, a bit more female than it used to be, and especially abroad. And as in the 1890s, it's the bigger clubs that benefit more. We have new forms of betting, in-game betting, fantasy football. We have intensive social media participation. It's less physically communal than football would have been in that earlier boom, concentrated tightly in dense urban environments. But we have all the fan sites, the text, the podcasts, stats sites, tactics sites. And we also get this sense, again, as we had in the 1890s, as football as a malady, a bad thing. It's an addiction, a drug. Football is a growing menace, surging uncontrollably over society. So it's interesting how quite a number of those things are reflected here and now. We also get football expanding into different areas. Fantasy football is a new thing. Championship Manager, FIFA Pro. These are incredibly popular gaming expositions of football. 11-a-side participation football by men is in decline in the UK, but what's taken its place are these special commercially run 5-a-side football courts that you hire for an hour in the evening. Women's football, we'll speak more of that in a moment, futsal, beach football, and old school reactions again to this. Non-league football has stood up remarkably well under all the top-down pressures, and I think it is about a retreat to an older or more authentic version of football. And there is a sense of going to the past for some people. Retro magazines, retro shirts, retro TV coverage, from the old archives. It's worth looking at for a moment at the evolution of professional women's football in the UK, where the FA took over governance in 1993 and set up its Super League in 2010 and ran it essentially as a summer league, but I think that was doomed to failure. From 2017, it became a fully professional winter league, and now, 30 years on from the FA's first involvement, they have 2 national divisions of 12 clubs each. And as in the men's game in the 1890s, we see the elimination of some smaller markets. It's interesting that only 2 of the current big 6 in England are in the top division of the Women's Super League 10 years ago. Last season, they were all present: Liverpool, Tottenham, Chelsea, Manchester, and the 2 Manchester clubs. Every Women's Super League title has been won by a Big 6 club, which suggests some kind of competitive imbalance there. And the original pioneers of the women's game, Doncaster Bells, Croydon, if you like, the old Etonians and old Carthusians of the men's game in the 1870s and 80s have gone. So what we see now are clubs in the women's game very largely aligned to a male league club brand, and pretty much a senior male league club brand. And we see that divisional places are allocated by licensing rather than straight promotion or relegation. The budget of the women's teams, their resources, their potential are taken much more into account in allocating divisional places, really rather like the Football League did in that period when Chelsea and Bradford City were admitted to the Football League without ever having played a single football match, but purely on economic grounds. So there's plenty of supply within the women's game in terms of sponsorships from Barclays, for instance, or in terms of prestige and saliency of Player of the Year awards. The National Football Museum has an intention of displaying men's and women's football equally on a 50-50 basis going forward. The BBC give the game plenty of airtime and website coverage. There is this massive growth in participation, which sits alongside and parallels the advocacy of healthy mind and body that we saw in the 1880s, but more specifically aimed at younger women now. And we have a pyramid structure and a World Cup and a Champions League. But there is a question of how much demand is there. Attendances are not growing for routine matches, that is matches that aren't put on in big stadia on special occasions. The aggregate, I think, of the 79 matches that weren't is fewer than the crowds for the 8 games that were. Low ticket prices are paid typically. We had an earlier talk in the Roses series about women's football in France, which show a similar average crowd of around 1,000, and gate receipts representing only 2% of the income for most of the clubs in that division. So there is insufficient revenue for these clubs to emerge as self-standing, able to own and build their own stadium. And that's also true in futsal, in veterans football, in five-a-side football. So let's make a comparison here. In league receipts for gates in league matches 2019. Remember Maidenhead from about the 3rd or 4th chart back in 1872? Well, they are now playing at the 5th level in England. So they are in the kind of pyramid of our 100th strongest club. And that's roughly speaking what their revenue is. This is Reading women, who are about 6th in the pyramid in Reading. They're in the top division, about halfway down. Now, these figures are very approximate and they're based on average prices paid, but you can see quite a significant difference there. And in real terms, the Reading men's team were taking 50% more at the gate in 1894 than Reading women are doing now. But they had to. They were totally reliant on gate receipts, whereas now there are new models, new financial models available to sustain expansions. The final slide here is to look forward to the 2020s, and I see another era of disruption. COVID is going to have the biggest effect on attendances, on habits, and on fixtures outside the world wars. And there's no rule that says you have to wait 100 years for the next big shift. So these are the top-down pressures that will be disruptive. Some of these are being fought against. I don't know whether they have been successfully resisted or they will come back again, but they are very much in the news and very much driven by the financially powerful elements in the English and European game. At the other end, I see the fragility of our 92 clubs across 4 division structure because of the finances. We talk about artificial pitches. That will have an impact on Football League membership. There are certain clubs just outside the Football League that need an artificial pitch to survive economically, but the Football League as yet won't allow them in on that pitch. And we also have, where are we going, how far down the competitive pyramid are we going to have VAR or unlimited substitutions? We are evolving into a game that has different rules at different levels, which was always the thing I think that the FA were desperately keen to avoid. So more disruption ahead. Thank you for your attention during this ramble, and please let me have any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. That was very, very interesting indeed. And I wouldn't have called it a ramble, certainly. I'm pleased to see that there's already one hand up. Stefan.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Stefan.
Fascinating. I'm always very interested in these historical explorations, and I had some thoughts, I think, on your. And you said you weren't going. There wasn't going to be a theory here, but actually you did sneak one in, and I want to challenge it, because that's what we do with theories. Because you weren't.
Wasn't one there, honest.
Sorry.
No, there wasn't a theory there, honest.
There was a theory that the reason that football caught on was because of something intrinsic to the game, and you had this very poetic passage about the warfare and seizing other people's castles and all that kind of stuff. And I do think I always challenge sort of those kind of cultural narratives, because it seems to me that culture, that what culture you grow up in is what you think is the best, and that's just the way things are. And I mean, if you think about, and I think the interesting parallel here is, so firstly, if you think about, you mentioned briefly baseball. I mean, this is an era when baseball becomes America's national sport, and it couldn't really be more different from soccer. And yet, for the Americans, it all of the kinds of virtues of manliness and rugged individuality and competitive striving, the same sorts of things you talk about in relation to football. So in that sense, I don't think that's any different. I think the other thing I wanted to point out is, and what you left out in your discussion of why football and not other sports, the one sport you didn't really talk about was cricket. And that actually, if you would ask people in 1910, what is the national sport of England, and probably England, not Britain, I think as many people would have said cricket as would have said football. And I think there are some interesting reasons why we see this divergence between football becoming the mass spectator sport and cricket increasingly becoming this elitist, specialist, upper middle class kind of activity. And that's a very slow burn. It takes really more than a century for that really to happen. But if we talk about the period that you're covering in the 1880s, in the same time as the Football League is founded, there is a huge proliferation of cricket leagues. I got a list here. The Bolton and District League in 1888, the Birmingham and District League in 1888, the North East Cricket League in 1890, the Lancashire League in 1892, the Ribblesdale League in 1892, the Leeds League in 1892, and so on. There are just dozens of these cricket leagues emerge exactly the same time. And a key difference here is not that the Football League was somehow unique. It's that what was unique about the Football League is it becomes national. And that never really happens with a cricket league. And here's the distinction you drew, where you talked about the North-South divide and the London snobs, upper middle class, public school boys, all that stuff that was going on in football. That's also going on in cricket. Only you can imagine in football, the southern elites tried to keep control of football and they lost. In cricket, the southern elites won. They succeeded in minimizing the role of league cricket, which had all the potential to have the same kind of national appeal that that the football league did, and could have turned England into a cricket nation, just like baseball became the national in the United States. And the other thing to say about this is that a key figure in this whole story is somebody called N.L. Jackson, who is the uber leader of the Southern elites. And he specifically identified leagues as being the kind of Trojan horse that would destroy amateurism. And you know what? He specifically pointed to leagues being an American invention. And because the whole concept of a league comes from the United States. It was the foundation of the National Association in 1871, and then the National League in 1876. And the concept of a league, and then the National League, the Football League, which became this vehicle for making football the dominant sport in Britain, also was actually something that we imported from the United States.
The point about cricket was that I was taking cricket to be already established as a sport before football became established. And it had quite a strong history, certainly in Reading. And I think a lot of the structure of the original Reading Football Club was based on the people and the venues of the Reading Cricket Club. So when I was looking for challenger sports to football, I discounted cricket because it was already established. I was looking at other possible new sports. I think you also do have the seasonal effect in that there are winter and there are summer sports. And football went into a gap because there was no winter sport of a team nature and that was followed by spectators.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. I mean, it's interesting to say when did football really supersede cricket fully as the national sport? I mean, I'm not sure what you think about it. My guess is actually it's after the Second World War, really, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd put it like that because I think that the bodyline controversy, you know, Douglas Jardine and all that sort of thing, was more important as a national issue than anything that football would have offered up to that point.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's a good point.
I do see football and cricket as very complementary sports, as did a lot of early footballers and cricketers indeed. And it's quite interesting. One of the things I am responsible for is the Reading FC Hall of Fame, and we're inducting at least 2 first-class cricketers into it this time round.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, lots of these limited companies were founded as football and cricket clubs, and at least Sheffield United remained the Sheffield United Football and Cricket Club until the 1980s, I think, actually. And Genoa in Italy is still the Genoa Football and Cricket Club.
Yeah. Yes, I can name at least 4 cricket grounds that Reading Football Club have played football on. The Oval, Gloucestershire Cricket Club, what else? Bramall Lane and Northamptonshire County Ground. There we go.
But it's also interesting how, I mean, I always think it's interesting because you have in the South, you have these elite sort of upper middle class individuals to dominate and dictate the rules of the sort of norms of amateurism and frowning on professionalism and commercialism. It's interesting to think how the ways in which the Southern clubs that did become professional, the ways in which they rebelled against it. What did it take to stand up to that that kind of bullying that you were getting from the tops?
Well, it's very interesting that you raised the name N.L. Jackson. He raised a team of Corinthians to come and play at Reading 3 months before the club turned professional. in a sort of charity match, and there was an extraordinarily strong team that was put out, and I think they were leaning on the club to stay amateur, knowing the way the wind was blowing. But there was quite strong resistance to that in the summer, and the club turned professional. And it was the fans and the local businessmen, rather than the more socially elite lawyers and accountants and schoolmasters, who won the day.
So when was that? That was which year?
1895.
So because Jackson then goes on to, he tries to form a breakaway association at the beginning of the 20th century. I think it's something like 1904. He founds the London Football Association, or he gets the London Football Association to secede from the FA, and to try and preserve amateurism. And for a while, he brings along some of his mates, but I think they give up in about 1910. So there was this moment where actually there could have been the amateur professional split, which, if you think about it, in most other sports, that's actually a fairly natural thing. The miracle of football, it always seems to me, is that amateurs and professionals have chose to remain within the same structure, and that is, I mean, again, in baseball in the United States, the amateurs and professionals just split completely, as they do in rugby, you know.
That was going to be my question, actually, was the difference between rugby and football in that respect. If the Toffs won in cricket, then in rugby there was such a split that there wasn't a unified nationwide game. Is that the idea? And that whereas somehow the two coexisted in football, it remained a nationwide game and it was able to succeed.
Yeah, broadly. I think it's also interesting. I mean, rugby is such an interesting case, because one thing is rugby seems to be so patchy in terms of where it's played, and there really are quite big differences even when you travel relatively small distances. And it relates to local culture, because the other great question I think here is you know, you have this emergence of this sport football goes from seemingly nothing in 1863 to the national game, or vying for national status as the game, by 1890. And did this just jump out of nothing, or was there already some embedded pre-football association football culture on which it drew? And there's been this debate amongst historians that there's, because traditionally the view was that football was sort of dying out at the beginning of the 19th century, and then it's revived by the public schools and Matthew Arnold and rugby and all of that stuff, and that's how it then spreads from the foundation of the Football Association, and sort of people seize on this. And Adrian Harvey and a number of his colleagues have argued against this and said, no, there was this kind of folk football culture that was everywhere in Britain. And it was just it was this that was converted into the codified association football after 1863. So Roger, do you have a view on that?
Well, I read Andrew Harvey's book, and I did find it very interesting and quite credible, and you know, nod to it in at the start of this, but I didn't want to get very much into that debate, which has become quite hot, as I understand it. And I understand there's also been quite a lot of pushback on Andrew Harvey.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. I mean, firstly, it's really bitter, this debate. So which is really
I'm a coward.
I don't know why people get so angry about it, but it does. I mean, I think I do know why. I think it leaches into politics, and this is about, are we going to give credit for the national game to a bunch of upper class rich people at Eton and Harrow and so forth, or are we going to attribute this to the great working class movement of the national people? And you can see how that becomes political dynamite, right? And there are a lot of Adrian's arguments. There are a couple of other historians who've been working with him, and yeah, I mean, the evidence is very scant, and the question is about, as always with this sort of historical debate, there's very little for us to go on, and so it is capable of multiple interpretations. And I suppose that's why then people get really angry about alternative interpretations that can't be proven one way or the other, right?
Rod Fort's put in the chat, I wonder if it's like this: gross takings from soccer fans greater than gross takings from fans of cricket in terms of money. Once the bad leagues are clearly the way to generate the most, the leagues ended amateurism because, well, the fans spoke. Seems to explain baseball as well, with its own amateur pro contention prior to 1875. Did you catch that, Roger? I don't know if my connection's a bit weak.
I don't know anything about revenues from cricket in this era. I don't. But I mean, people used to go to Old Trafford and Headingley and stand for 6-7 hours watching matches on terraces, I think. So, there must have been a fair amount of money in that. But how that could only have been at weekends, because people would be working for most of the time during a 3-day, the 3-day match, wouldn't they?
Well, but that's also the great sort of the great tragedy of cricket is that that's not what league cricket was. League cricket started on a Saturday afternoon and you finished it in the day. Yeah. And so it was not that different from going to a football match. And like I say, at this time, in this period that we're talking about, there are dozens of these leagues all across the country. It's the failure to find a way to unify these leagues and produce a national league, and largely because, I mean, the villains here, in my view, are actually the county cricket associations, which they want to take players from the leagues, want to compete with the teams in the leagues. They want to monopolize the upper level of the game. And there's discussion about things like promotion and relegation to the county level, and the counties just aren't interested in it. And again, one of the key things that made football so successful was the adoption by the League of Promotion and Relegation in 1892. And still, again, that's still one of the other great event in the history of football is the adoption of promotion and relegation, because without that, the game is utterly would be completely unrecognizable.
Yeah, no, I'd forgotten that cricket exists professionally below the county level. It doesn't round here.
But that's your north-south divide, right? In the Southerners, I mean, there was never much league cricket in the South anyway. So there's county cricket, but the league cricket in the North is incredibly strong. And, in the 1920s and 30s, some of the Lancashire League games, when Leary Constantine comes from the West Indies to play for Nelson, I mean, they're regularly getting crowds of 10,000 in the interwar period. I mean, it's very, very popular, and had all that you needed for it to be a national league sport. And really, 2020 cricket is just rediscovering what league cricket was in the 1890s.
I was going to ask you, what was the format of league cricket? Was it limited overs? Was there some way in which it was kept down to fit within that time frame?
It was interesting. So I've never quite grasped exactly what it was, but it basically works like this: is that if you want to win, there's no specific limit to an innings, but you're going to have to get the other team out. So the incentive to score rapidly was very strong, so that you could amass a big total and then give yourself time to get the other team out. And of course, if you were a weak team and you were out quickly anyway, then you were going to lose anyway. So there was, I mean, there were strong incentives in the league cricket system not to turn out to these long drawn out draws. So again, the Southerners, impose their kind of conception of this, which leads to this kind of very turgid kind of cricket. But the Northern cricket leagues are generating this hugely exciting game, which could completely have been, remained a dominant form of this sport for the control by the Southerners.
These Southerners, eh?
And Southerners.
Thanks, Stefan. Is there any other comments and questions people want to make? Seems relatively quiet. To carry on since
Hello?
Yep, still here, Roger. Well, a bit of an echo.
Sorry, a bit of flickering on the tube there. What did anybody make of the notion that different financial models apply to supporting different expansionary elements of the game, in particular supporting the women's game in a very different way in which the men's game evolved? That is within the UK context.
Well, wasn't the women's game just shut down by the FA there was huge potential at the end of World War I for a women's game to emerge, and the FA just banned it to protect the commercial interests of the football league?
No, I was thinking about the more modern aspect in the way in which it does seem that it's necessary for the large clubs to financially underwrite the women's game as it stands at the moment over what is a launch period, but quite a long launch period.
Well, I did a podcast for Freakonomics on this a few months ago about the women's game, and if you think about the obvious comparison is tennis, where there is a thriving women's game that does not rely on the men's game and never really has done. I mean, there was never a time when the women needed the men's support of the men in order to be competitive. And so my point is, if the women's game had been allowed to evolve naturally from in the 20th century, we wouldn't have this today. This is a consequence of the men banning the women from playing, then establishing. So think of this like antitrust. This is a dominant. This is an exclusionary practice practiced by a dominant competitor, which then prevents competition from emerging. And then later on, that dominant competitor seeking to control this alternative product and generate and manage it for its own interests. And so, and that if it was an antitrust case, it's just a clear violation. And in the US, you'd have to pay triple damages to the women's game for all the commercial harm that has been done in the last 100 years.
But was the women's game in any sense competitive in 1920? There were no competitive structures. There were very few matches that were watched by a crowd of more than 20,000 people.
Well, but that's why it was banned on, I think it was Boxing Day 1919. The Dick Kerr ladies team played at Goodison Park and sold out the ground. And that's exactly when the Football League clubs went to the FA and said, we can't be having this. It's commercial death to us. You've got to do something about it. And sure enough, 1920, they ban it.
That was one of only about three games that were played in women's football that attracted a 20,000 plus crowd, as far as I understand it. And I think all of those games involved the one team, who were quite a celebrity team. Well,
okay, but we could argue with the from this great distance about what we think the commercial possibilities were of women's football in 1920, but can't we just take the mere fact that the FA banned it at the insistence of the clubs to tell us that, yeah, no, it really was enough of a competitive threat back then for them to do something about it.
What happened in the US, out of interest, Steph? I don't know if you know, because you mentioned tennis, but equally NFL and NHL and so on, all these major sports leagues in the US are also, it seems, only recently developing their women's leagues.
Well, so women never played football, as far as I know, or only to a very limited extent. I think Rod knows a little bit about this if he's still around. In baseball, there have been women's league. You may be familiar with the movie A League of Their Own, which is about the creation of a women's baseball league that was created in the 1940s, and actually was quite successful and lasted for more than a decade, and was really eventually died out because of the monopoly of Major League Baseball that killed the independent minor leagues as well. I think the other one is basketball, of course, and basketball is interesting because, again, the rules of basketball were changed for women because it was unladylike for them to run around like in the way that the men did. So that's where you get netball from, which is really an adaptation of basketball. And again, remember, basketball as a successful professional sport is a relatively recent newcomer. Even in the 1960s, it's not that big. And the WNBA is probably the strongest professional women's league around. Again, Rod might have a view on that, but I think that would probably be fair to say.
Okay. Anna's put a comment in the chat, which she says, I think it was an interesting approach to compare, but I didn't think it was a fair comparison between the modern women's game and the Fifth League men's without taking in historical and cultural implications. I don't think there's a direct comparison. Perhaps I misunderstood what you were trying to imply with the numbers.
It was simply to try and get some kind of sense of what the bottom-up consumer demand was for two neighbouring clubs, in terms of judging popularity by gate money collected.
Yep.
And that would give you some sense of how far each commercial entity has matured over time.
I mean, I think it's an interesting comparison, and the whole way in which the Women's Super League is developing. The way in which, as you mentioned, these big clubs have stepped in, not least because presumably they can be supported by the bigger established men's clubs, names that we all already know, whereas the names that are big in their own right for being women's teams like Doncaster Bells and so on have disappeared, because once you have these big teams coming in, they can't compete anymore. I always wonder what drives. Is it simply a desire? I mean, if you're a football club like Manchester United or Manchester City, what makes you construct and subsidize that club? Is it simply the fact that there is much more of a drive towards equality in the game? Because
it's a corporate social responsibility agenda, I think, in that for these the big six clubs, it costs them very little to do this. It shows a corporate responsibility. Manchester United came under a great deal of pressure for not having a women's team, and responded by getting one and getting the license to go into the top division. So I think it fulfills that agenda. I also think it acts as a kind of a, a gateway into supporting the club as an entity. And Stefan was just talking about antitrust, matters. I mean, in a way, if people in West London go and watch Chelsea women as opposed to watching Kingstonian or Wimbledon or something, they're getting closer to the Chelsea brand and may well make their way into becoming lifetime Chelsea supporters of whatever expression of Chelsea football there is. So you can have more than, as we've seen with Manchester City particularly, more than one expression of Manchester City Football Club. You can have the veterans, you can have the women, you can have the Italian team, the Uruguayan team, etc., the youth team, and so on. So I think there are two things in it for the big clubs, which is the corporate responsibility agenda and brand extension agenda.
Matthew says, the thing is, Maidenhead United have been around since the 1870s and have a massive amount of massive amount of UK teams since the late 1800s. As Stefan says, the women's game in the UK was shut down post-war, so you don't have the generational links to the football team. People going today to see Reading or Maidenhead will have grandparents who went to watch the football with. So for the women's team in similar areas, it may well take 20 to 30 years to grow to have those kinds of relationships, I guess, in the local community.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It does take some decades to build these things, but you can look at quite a number of women's teams that have been active for 30 years or so, as I think, in various manifestations the Reading team has. It's much more difficult, isn't it, clearly, because you're bringing another flavour of football as opposed to football itself, which is what you were doing in the 1880s and 1890s. So, you are working in a more crowded marketplace. But by the same token, you can see that other expressions of modern sport, like the Rugby Union Premiership in the UK or T20 cricket, have moved pretty fast in terms of building gate-paying audiences.
Well, I think one thing that I guess perhaps points in the direction of the way in which football is going certainly is it's anecdotal, but I took my daughter to watch an Oldham match a few years ago, and this is no reflection on the quality of Oldham, but her first question was, where are the girls? There's no girls on the field playing the game. So her instant reaction was, well, why is it only men here? I mean, it's very anecdotal. I don't know how it necessarily fits in, but equally, I guess if people do start to emerge, the way in which we now approach gender diversity and equality, perhaps it's had more of a transformative impact than maybe it's had in previous generations, such that the initial response is that, and therefore now, I guess at least Man City can say, well, here you go, over here, here's the women's team, nice and successful, or here's the men's team, nice and successful. Matt says when he was at school, girls weren't even allowed to play football.
That's right. But I think the point is that I think it raises much broader questions. I mean, this is a situation that's being built on an injustice, and when we talk about the clubs that are party that are and beneficiaries of that injustice deciding how much to invest and telling us that they're doing us a favor because it's part of them being good citizens. I think we need to expose that kind of camp the whole time and say these people have a responsibility to make amends for an historic injustice. And if they don't provide enough investment now, I think that's again, they should be called out for not putting enough money into supporting the growth of the women's game.
I think that, at the level of Reading, they certainly are putting in an investment that isn't showing a return at present.
Well, also for Reading, it's a different thing than Man City or Man United, right? Because as you mentioned, in terms of the resource that they get in from the men's game, investing that little bit in the women's game isn't a particularly great cost to the big teams that are in the Premier League and getting hundreds of millions per year. But for Reading, who are in the Championship and not getting that, it is actually a significant choice to make that investment. It's investment that could be going into other parts of the whole football club in a different sense to the way in which, to kind of back up Stefan's point, the big clubs are kind of playing a bit of tokenism here.
Well, the Notts County women's team, which was apparently quite a good team, folded because Notts County could not maintain it financially. It was an absolute, they were in the 4th division, and it was an absolute drain on them. And some of the players came to Reading as a consequence of them folding. So yeah, it is a big cost. Reading employed 21 full-time professionals, female professionals.
But I think this idea that this is kind of a voluntary activity and we rely on the goodwill and the wealth of the individual clubs to do this, I think that's going to be a problem going forward. That will slow down the development of the women's game. What you really need, the Football League used to have a levy of 4%, which was paid centrally of gate revenues paid in centrally to the league, and I think they should bring back the levy, and you use that money to fund the women's game. And so it's not you're not doing this out of the goodness out of your heart. You're doing it because this is something that is this is a matter of social justice rather than your goodwill somehow.
Yep. Thanks, Stefan. We're heading up to 4 p.m, so I think it's probably a good point to call things to a close and say thank you again, Roger. That was a really very interesting talk on football's development over the past 150 years or so, with interesting and somewhat provocative thoughts about the way in which the game may develop, the women's game may develop. So thank you again. Thank you for the comments. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Matthew and Rod and Anna. I am going to try and share my screen for the poster for next week's talk. So here we go. This is next week. We've got Georgios Nelbantis from the University of Tübingen, who's going to be talking on substitution effects between international soccer telecasts. The only other thing to say before we wrap up, and this will be the last talk before Christmas, one final Christmas gift before the season really kicks off, is that if you do want to present in the Roses series after Christmas, please do submit a title and abstract on the Google form if you've seen the link. If you haven't, get in touch with me. If you do want to present, I'll be for you to present. So if you do want to present, please do get in touch. But thanks once again, Roger, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Cheers, everyone.